Listen in as your host, Richard Gordon, engages in one-on-one conversations with numerous leaders, elected officials, politicians, and others to learn what's happening in your state, on the Hill, and across America. Now, here's the host of Unconventional Times, Richard Gordon.
Hello, and welcome to Unconventional Times. My name is Richard Gordon, your host, and we're happy to have you here today, so thank you. Boy, what a roller coaster we've been on the last couple of weeks. The stock market has gone down and down and down, and then up and then down. We put tariffs on our friends like Mexico and Canada, and then put tariffs on the rest of the world. Then took tariffs off the rest of the world except for 10%, but increased them for China to 125%. It's hard to tell exactly what is going on, but people out there are worried and people are concerned. They've lost their college funds for their kids. They're worried about their retirement funds, their 401ks, and prices are going up. It's a perilous time. We live in unconventional times. So today, what I'd really like to do is talk to someone who has a wealth of experience in so many different walks of life, someone who has really been a leader in so many of the things he's done over the last, oh my goodness, 30, 40 years, and someone I'm proud to call a friend. Today's guest is Dan Glickman. Congressman Glickman was a 9-term congressman from Wichita, Kansas. He was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, serving in the cabinet under President Clinton. He also went on to be the director of Harvard's Institute of Politics and also was the chairman of the Motion Picture Association. So this is someone who has tremendous experience in so many things. Dan, welcome to the show.
Richard, it's great to be here. I'm glad to be here with somebody, a moderator that really knows the world very well. So I'm honored and awed to be in your presence.
Well, thank you. I will try not to let you down on that one. You know, there's so many things I want to talk to you about because you have seen so many things. You've done so many things. You've been a leader in so many things. But let's just talk about what's on everyone's mind first. Let's start with tariffs. First of all, there is tremendous confusion out there about what this is all about. On one side, you hear people saying, foreign governments have stuck it to the United States for way too long. This is so unfair. They're charging us too much, and we're going to get even with them. We're going to rectify this, and we're going to have reciprocal tariffs. Then you hear other people saying, whoa, 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 wait a minute. What's really happening here is you're raising prices to Americans. As a former congressman, Secretary of Agriculture, you have a unique position to look at this. Could you explain to the folks who are listening to us today what tariffs are, what they're all about, and how this affects average people?
Well, first of all, we live in very chaotic times because when you take away the substantive issue of tariffs, the process issue about how this is being done over the last several weeks is what is particularly disturbing. I mean, America has historically put tariffs on or taxes on or restrictions on overseas products, and other countries have done it to us over the years. We protect various industries. Agriculture is one that we protect in various ways, whether it's dairy or fresh produce or a lot of different areas. But of course, it's steel, aluminum, it's industrial products, it's everything else. And so there are legitimate reasons why a country would try to either restrict products from coming in or charge them more to reduce the amount that comes in, if in fact we're being either taken advantage of or the tariffs are beyond the pale in terms of rationality, or there may be some other reason for them. For example, human rights issues, for example. If we're trying to make a foreign policy claim, well, we might not want to take all these Chinese products, but we don't want to just flat out restrict them. So we put a price for them to come into our country, or it's a price restriction. And so we've operated this on and off, but mostly these things are negotiated over long periods of time. It's a foreign policy tool. And I think you've been involved with these, I've been involved with these in trying to do what's best for America, but at the same time not to disrupt the world as well. Because tariffs have a lot to do with political instability and geopolitical problems, and wars have occurred because of high tariffs over the years. And, the Boston Tea Party, in one sense, was an example of a tariff that occurred, a tariff-like event that occurred a long time But I think the big thing that's been concerning lately is the president, who apparently has a love affair with tariffs, just came in and, like a bull in a china shop, just unilaterally took action that affected the entire world on tariffs, not just country A or country B, but every country in the world, with the exception of Russia, which, by the way, he left out. Not exactly
So
sure
why
why.
is that? I noticed that as well, Dan. And it confused me. Like, why would he make such a big thing, let's say, out of China, but not a peep about Russia? I mean, he said more about Canada than he has about Russia.
Yeah,
Why?
I don't know. I have suspicions about why. There's some sort of relationship there with Russia that's been in existence for 20 or 30 years. I'm not going to make any allegations on this show, but it's weird. And and he would argue, well, we have sanctions on Russian energy, so to speak, or we participate with the Europeans on some of these sanctions. But it's weird. He announced these massive tariffs all over the world, including countries that have no people.
Right.
And and then we decide we're not going to do it on Russia. But who knows what the reason why is there? It's just Putin and Trump have a strange relationship. It's unhealthy for our country, but I think we've seen an example of it here.
So I don't understand the tariffs on France. So let's just take one country. Let's take Brazil. So we put a tariff on Brazil. We raise the price of coffee beans. So who gets hurt in that equation? How does it work? I'm the average guy. I go out and I want to buy a cup of coffee. How how does it work for me? What who gets hurt in that equation?
Well, somebody's got to pick up the cost. If we're going to put a tariff of, let's say, 20 or 30% on Brazilian coffee or other kinds of products, so that is collected somewhere, usually at the port. There's a process for collecting the dollars that the tariff goes into. But generally speaking, that's charged to the importer. So what does the importer do? Well, he's not going to just suck it up and take one for the country. He's going to pass it along to the supply chain. So at the end of the supply chain, the consumer ends up paying for either all or most of those tariff increases.
So
And
in other
that
words,
means you're going to have to pay more for your cup of coffee or for your car or for bicycles or anything else that you buy.
so in essence, it's a tax on me.
It's a tax on you. Now, he started out arguing intellectually that the purpose of this was to make it economically feasible to produce products inside the United States. Manufacturing was the heart of what he said. But of course, Brazilian coffee doesn't do much because we're not going to. Maybe the Brazilians are, investing some in America, and they're a competitor. Brazil has become a industrial powerhouse, and it's certainly in agriculture they're a huge competitor of the United States. But it's difficult to know the rationale between all these tariffs in terms of what we're trying to get out of these other countries. So, and back in the old days, before the income tax, tariffs were used largely as a way to raise revenue for the United States. But now our budget is so gigantic that tariffs could not possibly finance our government.
So the president keeps saying that this is going to be a great boom to the American economy, and it's going to be a way for us to eliminate the debt, the national debt. So explain to us how the boat of coffee beans comes in from Brazil, it docks in Miami, they pay the tariff there. Where does that money go? Where does the actual, money when the coffee beans come off the ship into the port? Where does the money they collect there go?
Generally speaking, it goes to either the shipper or the importer has to pay the tariff. But then when it goes down the supply chain, so then the importer then has relationships with retail or transportation or other segments of the company, they pass that cost along through a variety of accounting measures. And so it keeps being added. It's additive. It goes from point to point to point to point, and that tariff increase gets passed on in addition to the price of the commodity.
But is there money that actually goes to the federal government? Is there ever a check that gets cut to the federal government?
Yeah, there's no question that some of this is run through the federal government. And
Right.
we haven't used tariffs largely as a huge moneymaker for such a long period of time. By and large, our tariffs have been targeted on
Right.
over the years on companies that either have they protect their own products, so we need to reciprocate to try to get their tariffs down. I mean, the Trump goal of reciprocity in concept makes some sense. You want to, if somebody is really stiffing you, uh,
Hmm.
and the Chinese, for example, have a proclivity to either protect their products significantly or subsidize their products very significantly. And of course, we do some of that in the agriculture world as well. The U.S. is pretty good on protecting its own products, some of the agricultural products. Yeah, that money does go to the government. Some of the money goes to the government, but it's also passed through to the consumer as well.
Would it, I mean, is the basic theory correct? Would it help in reducing the deficit and therefore give us more money?
Well, nominally, unless you hurt the economy, and as a result of the tariffs, sales go down and people get nervous and they don't travel to the United States, they don't buy things, they don't go to hotels, then it hurts the economy because tax revenues go down.
Tax goes down.
Yeah.
Sure, sales tax, corporate tax, all of that. So when you were Secretary of Agriculture, how did you use tariffs? How was that the process? And if you wanted to change tariffs, how would you do it?
Well, first of all, you have the Department of Commerce and the Special Trade Representative were the ones that kind of were the focal points of the United States government to do that. The president did not get intimately involved in making those unilateral decisions. I mean, I assume it's been done before, but it's extraordinary. The president would say, okay, tomorrow China's going to go to 80% tariff. No, 125% tariff. That's never happened before. It's always pretty much a negotiated item
I
between
see.
us and whatever countries. And we've had these multilateral trade agreements, and we also have the bilateral trade agreements where we negotiate these things. And so these have been negotiated over the years, and there's kind of been a regular order to these things. Now, I think Trump is understands that there's a lot of frustration out there. That people think that we are being taken advantage of, and I mentioned China does that,
Sure.
and we see that on some product lines, for example. For example, fresh produce often gets protected, although we do some of the same things with our own agricultural products. But generally speaking, there's a regular order to this, and the president doesn't personally intervene and engage all the time. And so it's become an unseemly process. And as we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, one day up, one day down, one day up, one day down. And of course, what does that do to any business person in America who wants some predictability to their cost structure and their pricing, not knowing from day to day? I was noticing that the toy manufacturers are being hit by these very high tariffs, protecting toys that are largely made in China and Asia. And so from one day, a doll was $54. The next day, the doll was $28. The next day, the doll was $87 because the tariffs keep changing. And so I'm thinking to myself, and he's thinking, how am I going to cope? How can I be in business with this kind of thing? It's
Right.
so that I think is as much what the concern has been. The tariff prices themselves are a problem or an issue. And I'm not a tariff lawyer. I'm not a trade lawyer, so I don't know
Sure.
exactly how it works. But I will tell you that if a businessman and a consumer does not know from day to day, week to week, what the products are going to cost them, it's just a catastrophe for their business.
Yeah, it's when you can't predict. I heard someone on the news this morning, a woman saying that she's thinking of moving her supplies to Australia and trying to bring it in from Australia. But she said, I can't because I don't know what the tariff on Australia will be.
And it
So
could go up tomorrow or down tomorrow.
exactly.
I tell you in the agriculture products, so we sell a lot of soybeans. These things are all interrelated. So we sell a lot of soybeans to China. They're big buyers of soybeans because um, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay.
it froze for a
Oh,
moment.
you froze for a second. So a lot of soybeans to China, but Chinese matched our tariffs. So they said, I don't know what they said. We put 125% or 145% on China.
Right.
Chinese raised theirs to about 100%. So it's basically stopped. It's uneconomical to sell soybeans to China right now. So China has other options. Brazil is the largest secondary supplier of soybeans. Actually, they've surpassed us. And over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been issues about the reliability of U.S. supplies of agricultural products to China, because we've kind of been up again, down again, up again, down again. Human rights has been part of this thing. And so we've created a new market and a new competitor for ourselves. So it's just an example. These things all have relationships with each other.
So the president ran, I mean, one of the things the president ran on was, I think, quote, my love of the farmer. And I'm just curious how farmers are going to deal with this. I mean, you've been dealing with farmers for for most of your career, much of your career. How's the average farmer deal with this? If you're a soybean farmer, I don't know if Kansas makes soybeans, but
Sure.
it does. If you're a
Yeah.
soybean farmer in Kansas, how you've just lost your biggest market. What do you do?
Well, of course, I mean, you use the futures markets or you have crop insurance. There are some tools out there to protect you. And in the last restriction on the tariff restriction, which was in Trump 1,
Hmm.
the government provided about $28 billion in direct payments to farmers, just took it out of the federal treasury to
Right.
basically make farmers whole. Here's the irony,
Which
Richard.
is a subsidy, I assume.
The subsidy, just a direct subsidy.
Right.
But here's the irony. The irony is that Trump largely won his last election because of the votes in rural America and small towns. So he carried counties, majority of counties in the country went for Trump. Now they're rural counties or smaller counties. But there are counties in my state, my old congressional district, that went 10-1 for Trump. Okay, now these are rural counties. I don't think they went for him for economic reasons. I
Right.
maybe regulatory reasons, or but as much there were cultural reasons, the issues of guns, abortion, the non-economic reasons were a big factor in his victory, and the feeling that the Democratic Party was kind of out of touch on a lot of these issues. And so Trump got huge support from farmers, ranchers, and rural Americans. And if you look at the votes in the swing states, it's the rural vote that put him over the top in all
Right.
those. Okay. And so he loves farmers because he loves the votes. I don't think he knows one farmer from another farmer. I mean, he didn't, I worked for Bill Clinton, who really knew agriculture. He was the proverbial
Sure.
good old boy. Trump doesn't know agriculture.
Right.
And so Trump actually had a pretty good Secretary of Agriculture in his first term, Governor Sonny Perdue, who would he was the governor of Georgia before he was secretary. And he would
Right.
confront Trump and he would kind of squeeze out his worst instincts on a lot of these issues. But I'm not sure that's happening right now. But in any event, so Trump says he loves farmers. He loves farmers' votes. But these tariff issues are probably agriculture more than about any other segment of the American economy, the unpredictability about interest rates, and all these factors. And then Trump doesn't understand agriculture. So in his State of the Union speech, he says he wants to make sure that we don't have to rely on other countries and farmers can sell to Americans. And I thought to myself, great, but about 40% of our product is over and above what we consume domestically. We have to sell it overseas. We're
Right.
connected, inextricably interconnected. And so when he said, and then he said at the end of that to his farmers, have fun. He'd think like there was going to be some wonderful experience with what they were going to go through. So he doesn't understand agriculture or the farmers.
What works.
To him,
Look, farming looks like a lot of hard work to me, and
yeah,
I respect the work that they do,
yeah,
and I'm
and
happy that they do it.
rural Americans and people in small towns generally. It's not just the farmers themselves. So anyway, I think that I'm seeing some signs that there's pushback beginning to occur. Listen, if President Clinton or President Carter or President Obama had done any of these things, there would be rallies, demonstrations all over the country right now. And
Right.
there was when you may recall that President Carter put a grain embargo on the Soviet Union after they
Right.
invaded Afghanistan.
1980, right?
Okay,
79, 80.
1980. And
Yeah.
that was actually in global impact, that's much smaller than what we're talking about right now. But in any event, and it took 30 years for the political fallout to begin to fade a bit because farmers just turned on Carter and turned on Democrats for decades.
Wow.
It's not a very good parallel to today because here he's doing these things to farmers, and so far we haven't seen much of a fallout. We'll see it. It could happen.
Early. It's early.
Yeah.
Just a thought, well, two thoughts I had while you were chatting. One is, you used to have to go home to your district a lot and talk to the people and do town halls. We're seeing town halls, and this is a topic I actually want to get to later in our conversation, but the town halls have been getting kind of loud. That must be very difficult to go back to your district as you've done thousands of times and talk to people about issues like this.
Well, I like enjoyed that. I like the
Right.
interplay. I even like the conflict that would take place because, you're talking to 600 people in a crowd and somebody basically in their own way says you're stupid or you're a fool or you voted the wrong way. And, you could have fun in the interplay and everything else. It's gotten a lot more contentious today and a lot more personal security issues today because
Right.
when I did town hall meetings and I was in Congress in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I rarely it felt there was any kind of personal threat to my life or my safety. That's different now. There are threats to all these folks. So
Which
they
is
don't want
horrible and just,
to,
just,
but at the same
yeah, it's
time,
something terrible.
it's something terrible. But at the same time, you got to do it. I mean, you represent the people. You got to figure
Exactly.
out what's on their mind. And the nice thing about these town hall meetings is you get a diversity of opinion. And you get some people who say, I love you. You're the greatest guy in the history of the world. And that makes you feel good after the guy who says you're a jerk because of the way you voted.
Exactly. That's funny. Well, I want to get to Congress in a minute, but I don't want to get off food for a second. So let's talk about food for a minute. Again, you have done so much in your career in Congress, after Congress, including today, dealing with food insecurity. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the efforts you have done. This has been one of the hallmarks of your career. I've spent a lot of time personally working organizations to provide food to students on weekends, on the free and reduced lunch program, et cetera. But talk to me about food insecurity and your efforts in that regard, because I think that's something I don't think Americans really understand, how many children, especially, are food insecure.
Well, first thing in my experience was when I got on the Agriculture Committee in Congress, its jurisdiction was not only farmers, but it was also food insecure people. So the food stamp program was part of the authorizing jurisdiction within the Agriculture Committee. So I took a big interest in that because I represented a more urban area than most of the members did. Even though Kansas wasn't urban, Wichita, my hometown,
Wichita.
was an urban community, and also there were a lot of people in rural areas that took advantage of these food programs too. It's not just an urban thing. But in any event, it made me realize the significance and importance of our federal feeding programs. So in fact, we have the most advanced federal feeding programs in the world in the United States of America. Most people give their countries a kind of an income support system, and they can take cash and go buy their food. We provide a variety of options in America, but largely the SNAP program or the food stamp program gives people script or credit cards or something to buy food. And it's a big program. It's tens of billions of dollars a year, but it does a remarkable thing and we have no famine in America anymore. We have some hunger. A lot of this hunger is food insecurity in the U.S. is based upon people not eating nutritional food, not a complete diet. And I'm sure there are some people that go hungry. But by and large, our federal feeding programs, SNAP, school lunch is one of the biggest of all the feeding programs we
A lot
provide.
of those kids, their last meal is Friday lunch, and their next meal
Friday,
is
Friday
Monday.
lunch, and of course we have breakfast programs now as well
Yes.
as lunch programs. But in any event, there are and the WIC program, which is Women, Infant, Children, which is largely focused on pregnant women and babies. And there are other programs. The food banks, for example, the food banks in this country get much of their product from the federal government, and so people can go to their food banks and get food, and they do that, and that's a great safety valve. Most people who go to food banks also get SNAP benefits as well. But so the private sector donates. We have a system in this country that historically, by and large, has kept people from abject hunger, and it's not a totally well-funded system. I mean, the SNAP program is not something that gives people a huge amount of food. I forgot what the total allotment is now, but it's a few $100s a month for a family of four. It's enough to survive and cope, but not enough to really take advantage of.
Well, if prices go up, that's going to become a serious problem. I would
And then
assume.
we have the global side of the picture, which the U.S. has largely been the largest donor of food for humanitarian purposes in the world, and that's being challenged right now because the administration is cutting USAID, which is the
Right.
State Department entity that provides a lot of these funds. But U.S. agriculture supplies about $4 to $5 billion a year worth of food assistance to humanitarian disasters, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, that kind of stuff. That's being challenged right now as well.
With all that's going on with Elon Musk and this government efficiency, do you think the food programs to families and children will also be under attack?
I'm sure they'll be under attack, but there's a lot of support for them. For example, in the case of domestic food programs, there's a pretty significant anti-hunger community in the humanitarian side of the picture. But you also have a big food industry that has a big stake in this because about 15% of all food that's sold through grocery stores is SNAP purchases.
Oh,
So, so the grocery chains have a great stake in preserving these programs as well.
interesting. I don't think most people think of it that way, but the food stores make money off of this.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So it's got to go the positive and negative. One of the things I've been working on for some time is trying to improve the nutritional quality of food that goes into the SNAP program. The biggest single purchase of food under SNAP is sugar sweetened beverages.
Oh,
So I've obviously you think about, well, they should have the right to purchase what they want to, but these things cause chronic disease and diabetes and
sure, of
you
course.
know,
You know
and
what, but that's an interesting a segue into what I want to talk to you about also about this Make America Healthy Again program
yeah.
by Robert Kennedy Jr., Secretary Kennedy. Just your comments about it and what's the point and where's it going? And, we see conflicting things with Secretary Kennedy because on one hand, concern about vaccine. Today he made comments about autism. Then he talks about, I mean, and there's a whole movement. I'm noticing this movement around the country led by mostly from what it looks like mothers who are arguing that their children are not getting safe food. You're someone, USDA oversaw a lot of this. Explain
Yeah,
that to us.
I mean, the problem, first of all, I think that Kennedy's concerns are valid. That is, chronic disease is caused by a lot of factors, including a bad diet. And he also makes a point that we ought to have good science that governs these decisions. But then he uses bad science to justify no vaccines, lack of fluoridation. That's the big challenge right now. They're talking about taking fluoride out of the water supply. Um, and um, um, and the president has gone to date has gone along with him, but the scientific community is not. And so I'm just hopeful that we don't succumb to bad science making decisions regarding what kinds of foods and medical devices that we take. One example of this, by the way, is vitamins, food
Hmm.
supplements. They're not regulated at all.
Not by the FDA, not
Not
by
by the
anybody.
FDA. Okay, now why is that? Why would your vitamins not be regulated, but your food is? Well, part of it is that there's a very powerful grassroots movement out there protecting supplements, and they have resisted politically. They're very strong, and a lot of these are grassroots driven. They've resisted government regulation, and so people spend tens of billions of dollars a year on supplements. I take them myself, but I don't know whether they do any good or not, to be honest.
Yeah, that's funny. Um, Speaking about funny, this isn't funny, but I have to ask you anyway because in your book about your career and your life and your service, you talk about being the most assaulted cabinet member in history, which on one level is funny, but on many other levels isn't. Talk to us about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for mentioning my book. It's called Laughing at Myself, and we can always use more sales. But beyond that,
But you have always had an ability to laugh at
yeah,
yourself, and
yeah.
I think that's something
So
having held.
so my point has always been that self-deprecating humor is an ingredient which engages people with their politicians a lot better. If you look back, the politicians that have really had great impact on our society are those that had great senses of humor. Lincoln, Reagan, Roosevelt. There are three that come to the top of mind, but there are a lot of. Tip O'Neill had a good sense of humor.
Sure.
Alan Simpson, the senator from Wyoming, had a great sense of humor. And we kind of are in a senseless of humor period right now.
Very true.
Or else the humor that's used is bullying humor or humor to put people down. That
Belittling.
so I always found that great, the self-deprecating sense of humor, being able to make fun of yourself was really important in making constituents like you. And if they liked you, they'd be more likely to not try to chop your head off, so to speak, every time. And that worked for me for most of my life in politics. Now, when I got to the Department of Agriculture, I didn't realize how sensitive food was in people's minds. And so there are three or four examples here, but one example is that I went to the World Food Prize in Rome when I was secretary, and I led the U.S. delegation, and it was near the Vatican, and so the Pope spoke, and Bill Clinton spoke, and Fidel Castro spoke, and then we had a town hall meeting there with about 500 people, and it was 100 degrees in this room, and all of a sudden, in the middle of my discussion, the two front rows of the audience stood up stripped naked and had written on their bodies no gene beans, like no genetic engineering, and
Right.
the naked truth, and and then they threw soybeans at us, and I tend not to have a lot of hair, and I was sweating, and so these soybeans stuck in my head, and I said, "Gee, I hope that I'll grow hair when this dries off, and not soybeans." And people laughed, and whatever else it was, but there were naked people right in front of me. And
That's
so
so funny.
CNN was there, and it was in the early days of CNN. And so they flashed these pictures around the world, but in the US, the cameras put big black stripes over the appropriate parts of the bodies. And so my parents called me the next day, and they had seen the pictures, and they were calling from Wichita. And my mother said, "I told you should have never taken this job. This is a dangerous job." And then she said, "Just a minute, your father wants to talk to you." And my dad got on and he says, first question was, "Tell me, what did it look like?" So it was like, but I had several incidents like that. I had a group that threw infected buffalo guts at me because in Wyoming, because the buffalo had a disease called brucellosis, and they were infecting cattle, and the cattle were dying. So the Department of Agriculture was basically disposing of these buffalo before their natural death. So there were a lot of Native Americans and others and they threw infected buffalo guts at me. Sometimes you can get a disease called undulant fever, which is kind of like malaria. I didn't get it, but then I had a woman that threw at a nutrition summit at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington. And there were about 1,000 people there, and she ran up in the middle of the crowd and she said, "Glickman, you're nothing but a pimp for the meat industry. You should be ashamed of yourself." And she threw a bucket of tofu. No, she threw a tofu cream pie at me. I didn't know that there was. I mean, I knew that the Boston cream pie, banana cream pie, but not tofu cream
Not
pie.
tofu. Yeah.
And I ducked, and it hit Donna Shalala on the back.
Oh,
And she was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And Bob Dole was also on the platform with us. And Dole looked at me and he says, "Dan, I don't think we're in Kansas any longer." And
that's funny.
you
And
know,
that's a funny person. Talking about people with a sense of
well,
humor.
he had a great sense of humor, and it was also relatively self-deprecating.
Sure.
And my point on, so I told that story. I've milked that story till the end of the world because it's kind of, and there are more things.
It's funny.
People do care about food. I found out that there's a great human connection, emotional connection with food. And so, it does go to the point that how we've not lightened up, we've lightened down as a society over the last 20 or 30 years. And Bill Clinton had a good sense of humor. He was relaxed. George W. Bush had a very good self-deprecating sense of humor. These were not mean people that, kind of disparaged the country. Trump is just from a different world. He just does things differently than the other presidents. And
Good to laugh a little bit. I don't know why you were the most assaulted cabinet member in
yeah,
history, but it's sort of
yeah.
I'm glad you're here and healthy and
That's
no
right.
soybeans.
Well, and my hair has grown back in its hair, not
Yeah,
just.
there you go. There you go. Hey, I wasn't thinking of talking with you about this, but you brought up something that is interesting uh, about killing the buffalo before the food went to market.
Yeah.
We're seeing this over and over and over again with chickens. because of the flu that they've been getting and how that's affected egg prices and other prices. It seems that it's been American policy for many, many, many years to do that exact thing when there is an infection in a certain agricultural community. Um, People, I don't think, under President Biden understood that the price of eggs went up partially, maybe largely, because of this, avian flu and whatnot. What is the policy? Is it a good policy? I'm glad you didn't get hit by the buffalo meat, but
Yeah.
whole farms, Long Island and elsewhere, they're just killing millions and millions of birds to save the public from getting sick.
Yeah,
Policy or
yeah.
bad policy?
Well, I mean, there are different strategies there. There are vaccines, but it's very expensive to vaccinate individual chickens. You
And I
can
understand
imagine
you can't sell their products overseas if you do that.
you can't. That's right. In fact, they've restricted our sale of products even with non-infected chickens because some of these countries are worried that we don't have food safety systems in place. But I mean, to the larger point, food safety is a critically important function of the United States government. Both the FDA and the USDA are largely responsible for. USDA does meat and poultry inspection. Remember the days of Upton Sinclair when he wrote the book The Jungle,
Of
and
course.
that precipitated the Food and Drug Act and all the meat and poultry and food and safety inspections in this country. We largely do a very good job, but there are incidents that occur, and the avian flu and other livestock incidences are a problem to how to deal with them. And with respect to poultry, one of the strategies is to kill the chickens. And of course, you go into one of these poultry facilities, there are 500,000 chickens in the place.
Right.
There's no real way to vaccinate them very effectively. And so, but in any event, what we'd have to make sure we do is we have the resources and the dollars to protect the public against adulterated food. And that's something I'm watching very carefully.
Let me turn back to a topic that's come up a few times in our conversation today, and that's about Congress. I have a whole bunch of questions about Congress. Um, but let's just start here. You served in a very, very different time than today. Could you talk about that a little bit? How Congress has changed, public's view about Congress, members' relationships. How is it different?
Well, I would say that I served during more comfortable times. I had lots of friends on the Republican side of the aisle. I was what you'd call a centrist Democrat, so I represented a more conservative part of the country. So I had to be careful about my voting record, not to look like I was veering too far to the left, because otherwise I wouldn't keep my seat at all. But to your larger question, by and large. There was a pretty good collaboration between Republicans and Democrats when I was in Congress. But part of the reason why is because Democrats had big margins. So when I was elected to Congress, I think and this was 1976, I think there were 276 Democrats. Mind you, majority is 218 or 219, and that's where they are now. And then the next year was 1978, and we had 292 Democrats.
Oh my.
So it was fairly easy to have better relationships because we had so much power in the Congress. There wasn't much the Republicans could do to muck this thing up, so to speak. And Gingrich. Then after a while, the Republicans got agitated with all this, and Newt Gingrich was the character that created the modern world of confrontational politics. And he said, "Will the Republicans will never come back unless they attack, attack, attack." Destroy, destroy, destroy. And so they had a long-term effective strategy that ultimately resulted in the 1994 elections, which got rid of the Democrats as responsible for being a majority party. And I actually lost that year in 1994 because who tended to lose were the moderates. The liberals didn't lose. Moderates lost because
Is that because of your districts? Is that because if you were a liberal congressman from a liberal district in New York, you won, but if you're a moderate from a swing district or a in-between district
yeah,
in
yeah,
Kansas,
you're modeled from a swing district, and you were more vulnerable, and just it's the way it was. And so that year, the year I lost, there were 64 Democrats who lost that year, and most of us were what I call in the moderate center category. So, and the other thing we've talked about is there tends to be far fewer center legislators anymore. Most of the legislators are either to the left or to the right, and they appeal to their political base, which means they're less likely to want to work things out in the middle. Of course, the middle is where most effective policy is made. But relationships were also back different than Richard. I mean, again, many of my friends were Republicans and social friends, and so it's a tougher breed. And then the final thing is money in politics. So I ran in 1976 and defeated a Republican incumbent congressman and spent $96,000 total.
Wow.
Today, if I ran the same race today, I'd spend $96,000 a day, maybe.
Yeah. Wow.
And so the millions and millions of dollars, house races cost $10 million, $12 million. So when you're raising that kind of money, all you're doing is raising money. You're not necessarily working on serious legislative problems. And then the money is used largely to berate or try to destroy your opponent. So that's a whole different world as well.
Is this because of Citizens United, or is it because of a different tone in the country?
I think Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision, which basically changed the rules on how much you could give and who could give and all those things, had great impact. I think Newt Gingrich was very effective in 1994 in realizing that he had to copy the techniques that had been used in other places in the country and the world in terms of spending a lot more money early on, getting members to raise money. For example, back then you would never go into another congressman's district campaign against him. Right. Even if it was a Republican I didn't like, I just would do that. Today it's all the time. People are going to other people's district. You think that creates goodwill? Not really.
No. But there's politics and then there's human beings. And it also seems, and I've heard you talk about this in other times, about the civility, about the niceness. I mean, earlier we talked about going home as a congressman and going home to your district and meeting with constituents. In my day, when I worked on the Hill, for example, I mean, people would disagree with a congressman, but they wouldn't yell and shout and call them names and do all types of horrible things. What's gone on? What is the issue with civility? Is it a political issue or is it a societal issue?
I think it's complicated. It relates to a lot of factors. Our education system, I don't think, has done a very good job teaching people about our political processes. That's largely our public education system. I think that the nature of the media today is a much more disruptive media. We're not going to go back to Walter Cronkite and 3 television anchors. But today, have fractionated media. People watch what agrees with them, what they like. Don't watch the other side very well. And I talk about people, I mean people at home. So I never realized, even when I was in the later days and in the House, the power of Fox News in terms of my constituents. Most of them were watching Fox News. They weren't watching the other kinds of things. And so I think that has had a lot to do with it. I don't know. It's like and then of course the Trump effect is all just hostility and negativism and berating people and everything else. But it started before Trump. I'm not going to say he caused it all.
No, in some ways, I think he's a reflection and not the origin.
But let me tell you, it's not all terrible. There are a lot of very good members of Congress of both parties. They do collaborate a lot on the smaller issues, working together out. What's missing is the big stuff, the debt, the deficit, the spending and the tax bill, how it relates to the rich and the poor alike. And those tend to not get any consensus at all, and governments get shut down. Congress has been shut down now 5 or 6 times in the last 10 or 15 years. It makes people think the system doesn't work very well. I think most members would like it to work better. There are a lot of bipartisan friendships across the aisle, but systematically it doesn't work very well anymore.
It seems it's party over country. It seems my winning is more important than anything, and you're a loser. I have to win, you have to lose. It seems
and very tight margins accelerate that problem. So if you had 292 Democrats, we would not be having the exact same problem that we have today. The Republicans, what's his name, the Speaker Johnson, he has to deal with a margin of 2 Can you imagine that? I mean, it's like there's no room for misjudgments at all.
Right.
Join us next week for part 2 of Richard's interview with Dan Glickman on Unconventional Times with Richard Gordon. You've been listening to Unconventional Times with your host, Richard Gordon. Check out all of the episodes of Unconventional Times on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Richard Gordon and all of his unconventional conversations, head on over to unconventionaltimes.com. Thanks for listening.